Hello. Today I'm speaking with Dr. John Azumah, the author of the book, The Legacy of Arab Islam in Africa. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you please just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from and what work you do?
Yeah, I'm originally from Ghana, in West Africa, and presently I teach at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur as the Associate Professor for World Christianity and Islam.
Now, why did you write this book?
Well, first of all, I wrote the book. It's a publication of my doctoral thesis, which I did in the University of Birmingham, UK. And I wrote the book because there was very little writing on some of the themes that I wanted to address, that I addressed in the book, having to do with the theme of Islam's interaction with African traditional religions, the whole history of jihad in West Africa, and as part of that, a very important part of that, the slave raiding and the slave trade that happened within West Africa by Muslim communities. That was why I wrote the book, because not many had written on these kind of themes in Islam history in West Africa.
Now, I'd like to look at one of the topics in your book, the topic of colonization. We know that the Christian West colonized Africa. The West has acknowledged this and is self-critical in this regard. Did the Islamic empires colonize Africa?
Well, yes, there was a lot of activities on the part of Muslims in Africa, especially in West Africa. What happened there was not necessarily outside colonization, but there was a form of colonization in the sense that the dominant Islamic tribes conquered weaker tribes and imposed Islamic rule over them. And therefore, there was some kind of internal colonization going on. The Fulani in West Africa in particular were very much in the habit of conquering and imposing Islamic rule on other tribes. So that was a form of internal colonization, yes.
What about with the Arab conquest of North Africa? Was that a form of colonization?
Absolutely. That the Arab conquest of North Africa was a form of colonization that took place in the 7th century when Arab Muslims burst out of Saudi Arabia and conquered Egypt and went on to conquer the whole of North Africa. There were a lot of Berber tribes there. The Egyptian Copts were the original indigenous of the land, as well as the Berbers. And they were all conquered and Islamized and Arabized. That was also a form of colonization, definitely.
Now, do Muslims today acknowledge this? Are they self-critical about this?
Not to the extent that the West has become very critical. In fact, many Muslims don't even admit that there was any form of colonization. Even though if you talk to the Berbers, and let's be also aware that many of the Berbers have become Muslim, the Berbers will tell you they have been colonized. There's been Arab imperialism. The same thing in Egypt. The Copts know that they are the original, the indigenous of the place. They feel like they have been colonized. The same thing will happen we talk to Sudanese. They will tell you that Sudan was colonized by Arab Muslim invaders. So yes, they will not admit it, but there is that kind of history there.
Okay, thanks for that. I want to move on to the topic of slavery now. Did the Muslim empires practice slavery?
Absolutely. Slavery was a very important part of Islamic expansion in West Africa, and in fact in the Sudan, and from the very earliest period of Islamic penetration into Africa. It started by buying, purchasing slaves and trading in slaves, and then it went on from purchasing to raiding for slaves and capturing slaves deliberately, especially mainly black Africans, and transporting them into North Africa and into Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and onwards to the Ottoman Empire to Turkey. So slavery was a very endemic part of Islamic interaction with Africa. And in West Africa, the jihad's period of the 18th and 19th century involved massive slave raiding and slave trading. And many of the slaves that were captured and sent and sold and taken into the transatlantic slave trade, most of those who were doing the raiding at the time were Muslim communities because they were the dominant tribes. So a lot of that happened. That is not to say that non-Muslim communities were involved in raiding, but the dominant tribes were the Muslim communities that were doing the raiding at the time.
The treatment of slaves is a topic that you bring up in your book. Can you talk about some of the differences in the way that slaves were treated in the Western world compared to in the Islamic world?
Yeah, one of the themes I explored in my book is this perception that Muslims treated their slaves much more humanely than the Western slave trade. And what I found out in my own research was that that is not necessarily the case, and that there were very harsh treatments of slaves by Muslim groups. It was just a done deal at the time. And one of the key differences I looked at in my book whereas slaves taken to the West were able to marry and reproduce and have their families, and you can still find large populations of African Americans today in North America and in the Caribbean. You go to the Islamic world and you find very few black remnants of the slave trade, which was very massive. And one of the reasons is that many of the male black slaves taken into the Islamic world were castrated as eunuchs, which meant that they could not, of course, reproduce. And the other factor is that many of the women were taken as concubines by their slave masters, and they gave birth to mixed races, and they were very much absorbed into the society. So you don't have black slave and kind of descendants in the Muslim world as you would in North America, and part of the reason is the castration and the way the slaves were treated.
Did the Islamic world abolish slavery?
Slavery persisted in Islamic countries far, far longer than it did in the West. The West abolished slavery long before the Islamic countries ever abolished slavery. And they did so under a lot of pressure from colonial governments and from Western governments and from all kinds of activist groups. And in fact, the Saudi Arabia, for instance, abolished slavery in 1961 or 1960 thereabout, whereas Mauritania abolished slavery in 1981. And these were done on paper, and a lot of it is still being done. In practice, there are still a lot of slaves in Muslim countries. And Sudan, during the Civil War, there was a lot of slave raiding going on done by the Arab Muslims in the north against the enemies and the Christian Africans in the south. So even up to the 90s and this century, there was still capturing of young African men, boys in the Sudan for sale. So slavery continues, even though it has been abolished on paper in many Muslim countries.
I often hear Muslims talking about the golden age of Islam, and they look back to this as the time when Islam ruled, and this is the golden period that they look back to. What's your understanding of the golden period, the golden age of Islam?
Yeah, it depends on which Muslims group we are talking about, but the golden age of Islam, many Muslims look back to the period between the 7th and the 9th century, when during the Abbasid Caliphate, or rather from the 9th century to around the 13th century, during the Abbasid Caliphate. They talk about it as the golden period of Islam. But if you look at that history, it is fraught with difficulties, with a lot of problems. Yes, a lot of progress was made under that period. There were times of very stable rulership. There were times of progress in terms of learning and science and exploration. There was a lot of that going on, but that does not necessarily, and that was the time that Islamic orthodoxy was formalized. So there were a lot of milestones within that period, But in terms of golden period, I think it's very tricky to begin to talk about golden periods. If we look back and look at how messy the whole situation was at that period and many other periods in Islamic history, just like many of the other empires.
Yeah, because from what you were saying, it was a time of conquests, colonization and slavery as well.
Absolutely.
With everything else.
Absolutely.
So there may have been those great moments, but there's still conquest, yeah, colonization and slavery is part of it.
Absolutely. And during that time, it has to be said, Muslims were not the only ones who were conquering, other people were conquering also. And slavery, yes, during the 9th up to the 13th century, slavery was still very much an Islamic phenomenon as compared to the West. Of course, there was ancient slavery in many other societies, but in terms of chattel slavery, in terms of slavery as an institution, that was profitable. That was very much still an Arab Islamic preserve until the West came in sometime from the 15th, 16th century onwards. So yes, there was a lot of that as part of that so-called golden period of Islam.
Now, discussing these ideas in our universities is not always an easy thing to do. In your book, you write, hence, in the study of Islam in the West, the dominant convention is that a critical approach is reserved for the Christian past, but forbidden for the Muslim past. The net result is a romantic picture of the history of Islam, avoiding and sometimes denying such issues as the jihadist slaughter and mass enslavement of traditional African believers. Can you just talk to us a bit about your experience as an African in the Western universities talking about these issues?
Yeah, that is actually a very important question. I, as an African who embarked on the study of Islam in Africa, was very frustrated that, especially back in the 90s when I was doing my studies, that Western academics were shying away, almost self-censoring on these difficult themes of jihad, of the violence associated with jihad, and the slave raiding and slave trade that was very massively undertaken by Muslim societies in Africa. And some only noted in a footnote, and we don't want to discuss it. And that was very frustrating. Meanwhile, they will go at length and talk freely and openly about the Western transatlantic dimension of slave trade. And so for me, this painting of a very romantic picture of the Islamic past in Africa was hindering interfaith dialogue and dialogue between Muslims and Christians in particular. And especially in a situation where the radical Muslim groups were laying claim to these histories, these romanticized histories that was written mainly by Western scholars, that they had a golden age of Islam in Africa that they want to return to. Unfortunately, many of the groups that we have today that are ideological Muslim radical groups, and even Boko Haram in Nigeria, are laying claim to some of these romanticized histories that has been contributed to by Western scholarship and academia on the West of Islam in Africa. And this is what I was trying to challenge and to raise questions about, that we have to paint a more realistic history of the past. Africans have to get a more holistic history of their past if we have to live together, have meaningful dialogue between ourselves as Muslims and Christians.
So what do you think is the way forward?
Yeah, as I explored in my book, the reason why I wrote this book was not to be polemical against Islam or anything of that sort. It was simply to say to African Muslims, my co-Africans, fellow Africans, that look, both on the Islamic and Christian fronts and on the past, we have difficult histories with the way these traditions interact with Africa. So we need to take both histories critically. We need to study the histories critically instead of denial and romanticizing one history. Because when we do that, we are not going to, unless we understand our past very clearly and honestly, we cannot move forward with any sense of integrity and mutual respect. So the whole idea is, how do we move forward? Let's have a much more critical discourse of our past, and then we can move forward with meaningful futures together. That's the only way to move forward in this.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
Thank you.